Kia ora, and welcome to this training about gender, sexuality, and autism. I'm going to start us off with a karakia, and then I'll introduce myself and we'll get into the presentation. So, kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, he huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa, huie taikie. So my name is Rachael Wiltshire, and I am a live chat agent and researcher with Altogether Autism. I'm autistic myself. I was diagnosed when I was 12. I've been very interested in autism advocacy basically since then. Before I moved into the live chat role at the beginning of this year, I worked as an autistic advisor to Altogether Autism. So today's presentation is about autism, gender, and sexuality. And so there's kind of two main things we're going to look at there, which is sex differences in autism. So does autism present differently in males and females? And then also the intersection of autism and LGBTQIA+ identities. And so that includes looking at sexuality in autism and also at gender identity in autism. So to start off with looking at sex differences in autism, we normally think of autism as being a primarily male diagnosis. So the gender ratio that's normally reported is about 3 to 4 males to every female. However, we do have reason to believe that this is probably not an accurate reflection of the true gender ratio, and that many girls and women miss out on autism diagnoses because we have the stereotype that we have of autism is primarily of how it presents in males, and also a lot of the diagnostic criteria were developed based on how autism presents in males, and so females get missed. So, for example, we know that up to 80% of young women who are autistic may still be undiagnosed at age 18. And also McCrossan has done some mathematical modelling which suggests that the true gender ratio may actually be 3 males to 4 females. Now, it's important to note with this study that he assumes that we're finding and diagnosing all males, and that's probably not a true assumption. It's probably true that we are missing some males as well as females. So perhaps what that modelling suggests is more that the ratio should be closer to 1 to 1. We also know that females tend to be diagnosed later than males. So this graph is from that Rutherford study. And you can see that as people get older, the gender ratio decreases. So for children under 9 years old, it's about 5.5 boys for every girl. Whereas by the time you get to teenagers, 10 to 18-year-olds, the ratio has already dropped to just over 2 boys for every girl. And by the time you get to 40 years and older, it's dropped even more to just under 2 men for every woman. And so again, this is all supporting the idea that women are getting missed or are getting diagnosed later. Now, there's a number of reasons why girls and women may be underdiagnosed. The first one is this idea of an internalized presentation of autism. So it's important to remember that there's not a male version of autism and a female version of autism. Autism is a really diverse experience, and so people of any gender can present in many different ways. However, it is true that for a lot of girls and women, that presentation is more internalized, by which we mean that they may not display the sort of typical external behaviors that you might expect to see in an autistic boy. So they might stim less obviously, they might tend to have more mental health consequences as a result of being an undiagnosed autistic. They might tend to shut down rather than melt down, for example. And because they have that internalized presentation, it's sort of all happening under the surface, but it's not really obvious to an external viewer, that means that they don't get sent for a diagnosis. There's also a phenomenon known as masking. So this is when people essentially camouflage their autistic traits in order to appear more neurotypical, which obviously makes moving through the world much easier. Again, this is not something that only girls and women do. It is a phenomenon that all autistic people do to some extent, and it is not always conscious, so it's something that people can pick up on unconsciously. But again, it may be that in general, girls and women are better at masking. That may in part be due to the way in which that they are socialized. It's possible that the sort of corrections that we give to young girls tend to encourage them to mask more. It may also be that neurotypical young girls are sometimes a bit more accepting of difference and will tend to kind of gently correct or redirect an autistic girl into the appropriate social behavior, and so help her to develop that mask as well. Also, what frequently happens for women is that they get labeled with a whole bunch of other mental health diagnoses because of this stereotype that women can't be autistic. So they are presenting with many, many challenges and they're getting mental health diagnoses, but the underlying cause of being autistic is being missed. So there's two things going on here. It could just be that what is actually autism is being misdiagnosed as depression or anxiety or an eating disorder or whatever. It can also be that the stress of being autistic and not knowing that is causing people to develop depression, anxiety, eating disorders, that sort of thing. Now, a really important consideration is that autistic women are at really high risk for sexual abuse, and this is maybe particularly the case for women who are undiagnosed and so have not had the chance to put effort into developing skills that will keep them safe. So Bargelia, Stewart, and Mandy interviewed 14 late diagnosed autistic women, and they found that 9 of those women were survivors of sexual abuse. And they identified 5 interlinked reasons that caused young women to end up in unsafe situations. So the first of these reasons was social mimicry. So one of the interviewees said, there's this potential for you copying a guy's flirtatious behavior without realizing that that's what you're doing. So this social mimicry is, again, one of those kind of masking skills that people develop as a way of appearing neurotypical. But obviously, if you're doing it unconsciously and accidentally copying someone who's flirting with you, you may end up accidentally sending the wrong message. Women also had difficulty reading people's intentions, so they could struggle to know whether someone was being friendly or whether they were being flirtatious. Social isolation was also a really big cause of this risk. So neurotypical teenage girls will go out in groups, they will talk to their friends, and they'll develop safety skills as a result of that. Because autistic girls didn't tend to have many friends, they didn't get the chance to develop those safety skills in that group situation. Also, many women really wanted to be accepted and liked, and so that left them vulnerable to exploitation. So one woman said, because we don't sense danger and can't. That's one reason. I think you're not reading people to be able to tell if they're being creepy. You're that desperate for friends and relationships that if someone is showing an interest in you, you kind of go with it and tend not to learn from others' safety skills. And finally, there was uncertainty around social rules. So women didn't always know that they could say no, or even if they did know that they could technically say no, they didn't know how to say no or how to leave a situation that was unsafe. Just to give you an example of that from my own life, I remember once when I was at university walking to a dance class and I heard someone behind me say "Tu es très jolie." I was learning French, so I was like, that's a bit weird that he's speaking to me in French. But I was like, well, the polite thing to do would be to talk to him. So I end up in this conversation with this older man. It ends with him asking me for my phone number and giving me a hug. And I remember being in that hug and thinking, if I get, I'm going to get hurt and it will be my fault because I talked to him and I should have known not to talk to him, but I wanted to be polite. And afterwards, my parents were like, you didn't have to talk to him. Like, it's not a rule that you have to be polite to everyone who shouts something at you on the street. And also, you don't have to give him your phone number. You could give him one of our phone numbers. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I had, growing up, developed this skill of being polite, because then at least that kind of got me through social situations, but it could also get me into trouble. And so it can be really helpful for women to get the chance to practice those types of situations, to learn scripts for how to say no, or to learn that it's okay to not give out your phone number or to give them someone else's phone number, and to practice doing that so that it comes naturally. Now, importantly, this study did find that over time, people did get better at being assertive. And again, that could just be through experience, or it could be because it was something that they actively worked on, for example, with a counsellor. But also for some women, their autism diagnosis actually helped them to feel more confident in being assertive. So, for example, one woman said that post-diagnosis, she was more confident in asking for clarification, because she knew that it wasn't just that she was weird or didn't understand, it was because she was autistic. And so that gave her the confidence to ask for what she needed. So I'm going to switch track now and talk about the intersection between autism and the LGBTQIA+ community. So just to start with, we're going to go through some terminology. These definitions are adapted from Inside Out's terminology handbook. So the first 3 slides are terminology to do with gender, and then on the last one, we'll go over a bit of terminology to do with sexuality. So sex is the classification of someone's body based on things like their genitals or their chromosomes, whereas gender is how we identify and define ourselves based on the roles, expectations, and assumptions we're socialized into. It's important to remember that understanding of gender varies across cultures and also throughout history. And then we have gender expression, which is how a person expresses their sense of gender through things like their clothes, their mannerisms, and their voice. And it's important to remember that the way that someone expresses their gender doesn't always align with how they identify. So cisgender is someone whose gender aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth, whereas transgender is someone whose gender does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Someone who's non-binary, their gender doesn't fit within the man-woman binary. And then gender diverse is an umbrella term that refers to a diverse range of gender identities, including culturally specific ones and those that fall outside the man-woman binary. Gender dysphoria is the discomfort that a person experiences due to a disconnect between their body and their gender identity. It often causes distress, anxiety, depression, and trauma. Whereas gender euphoria is the opposite. It's the positive feelings that a person experiences when the way they see their own gender and body aligns with how others see them. And then transitioning are the steps that some trans and non-binary people take to affirm their gender. So this can include social, medical, and legal processes, such as using a different name or pronouns, changing their gender marker on legal documents, and hormone therapy. And so for some terminology around sexuality, now these are not all the terms that people will use to identify their sexuality. I've chosen to define these ones because they are the ones that are cited in the research that I'm going to quote from. So we've got asexual, which is someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction and or lacks interest or desire for sexual relationships or activity. Also important to note, some asexual people will separate out their sexual and romantic identities. So some people are aromantic, which means that they don't experience romantic attraction. So some people might call themselves aroace, which is aromantic and asexual, but equally some people might be, for example, asexual but biromantic. So they might be interested in romantic relationships with people of any gender, but not interested in sexual relationships with anyone. We've also got bisexual, which is someone who is sexually attracted to people of more than one gender. Homosexual, which is people who are exclusively attracted to people of the same gender, and so this is people who might identify as gay or lesbian. And heterosexual, which is people who are exclusively attracted to people of a different gender, and so these people might identify as straight. And pansexual, which is someone who is attracted to people regardless of their sex, gender, or gender expression. So autistic people are much more likely to be LGBTQIA+ than non-autistic people. So just a couple of statistics about this. So Weir, Allison, and Baron Cohen surveyed 2,386 people aged 16+. They found that 12.6% of autistic people identified as transgender compared to just 2% of non-autistic people. They also found that the autistic people were less likely to identify as heterosexual, so only just over 63% of autistic people identified as heterosexual compared to about 83% of non-autistic people. The autistic females were more likely to identify as homosexual than non-autistic females, and autistic males were more likely to identify as bisexual than non-autistic males. And also autistic people were much more likely to identify as asexual than non-autistic people. So about 10.05% of autistic people identified as asexual compared to just 1.51% of non-autistic people. The Counting Ourselves survey surveyed trans and non-binary people aged 14+ and living in Aotearoa. They found that 22% of their respondents identified as neurodivergent. So neurodivergent is an umbrella term that covers anyone whose brain works in a way that's not how society would expect. So anyone who is not neurotypical. So that includes autism, but it also includes things like ADHD, dyslexia, mental health conditions, traumatic brain injury. So that doesn't necessarily mean that 22% of the respondents to this survey were autistic, but 22% of people felt that they fell somewhere under that neurodivergent umbrella. And then we've got McQuaid, Gendy, Lee, and Wallace surveying 651 autistic adults living in the US. And so they found that about 41.2% of their respondents reported what they referred to as a sexual minority identity. So basically reported any identity other than heterosexual. And that was compared to just about 4% of people in the general population who report a sexual minority identity. And then specifically, it was 9.52% identifying as asexual, 12.9% identifying as bisexual, 7.99% identifying as gay, and 6.76% identifying as pansexual. Also, they found that autistic females were more likely to report a sexual minority identity than autistic males. So about 51% of people who were assigned female at birth reported a sexual minority identity, compared to about 25% of individuals who were assigned male at birth. And that is similar to the general population. In the general population, we tend to find that females are also more likely to report a sexual minority identity than males. So people who are both autistic and have some form of LGBTQIA+ identity do face a number of challenges. The first is in terms of mental health. So autistic people are at an increased risk for mental health challenges, including suicide, and LGBTQIA+ people are also at an increased risk for mental health challenges, including suicide. So you'd expect that when someone is both autistic and LGBTQIA+, they would potentially be at an even higher risk for mental health challenges. And that is what McQuaid et al. Found when they surveyed autistic adults who belonged to a sexual minority. They found that they experienced more anxiety, depression, and perceived stress than heterosexual autistic adults. And sexual minority autistic adults also reported a lower subjective quality of life than heterosexual autistic adults. There's many possible reasons for these poorer mental health outcomes. So those might include, for an autistic person, their support needs not being met, so them not getting the support that they need to be able to go about their daily lives in an easy way. Loneliness is also a really big one. Some people felt excluded from both the autistic community and the LGBTQIA plus community because of their intersecting identity. So they felt that they didn't really fit in with either group. Autism acceptance is also an important factor in terms of mental health. So in general, people who are able to accept their autistic identity as a positive thing report better mental health outcomes than people who are not able to do that. And also masking is a predictor of worse mental health outcomes. So masking, camouflaging your autistic traits, takes a lot of cognitive energy, and so that can lead to things like anxiety, depression, and burnout over time. For LGBTQIA plus autistic people, they might feel a need to double mask. They might need to mask both their autistic and their LGBTQIA plus identity because they fear discrimination or feel a need to conceal one or both of those identities for some reason. And so that need to double mask may further increase the risk of poorer mental health outcomes. Autistic LGBTQIA plus people could also feel excluded from the LGBTQIA plus community. So, for example, stereotypes about autism could be used to exclude autistic people. So these quotes are all from a study by McAuliffe, Walsh, and Cage, and they had one person say that there's this perception that autism somehow disqualifies people from knowing who they are. Also, particularly for people who identified as asexual, they sometimes found that the legitimacy of their orientation was questioned. People would say, well, isn't being asexual just part of being autistic? Obviously, it's not. We know that maybe about 10% of autistic people identify as asexual, but that means there's 90% of autistic people who don't identify as asexual. But also, many of the spaces where you're likely to meet other members of the LGBTQIA plus community, like bars and Pride, were really inaccessible. So one person describes them as loud, annoying, and not accessible. And this was due to both sensory and social overload. This impacted on people's ability to fully participate in events. So one person said, I just couldn't cope with the sensory stuff and all the social stuff. I didn't really know people and I just found it highly stressful. And also, sometimes people tried to use strategies to cope with this sensory and social overload, but that was then perceived as weird. So one person talked about how they would sometimes step outside of the pub if the music got too loud or overwhelming, but then people made them feel that doing that was weird. There are also specific challenges that autistic, trans, and gender diverse people face. One of the big challenges there is access to gender-affirming healthcare. So there's a number of reasons for this. The first one is that healthcare providers lack knowledge about autism. So these quotes are from a study by Bruce, Monday, and Cap from 2023. They found that for the gender diverse autistic people they interviewed, many of them found that their healthcare providers lacked knowledge about autism. So one person noted that even when a professional's knowledge seemed fairly decent, they did not think they had done a good job of actually accommodating their needs. But also, many people felt that they were infantilized after they disclosed that they were autistic. So one person disclosed that they were autistic, and then found that their healthcare provider started talking to their friend who they had brought along to support them through the process. The healthcare provider assumed that this friend was their guardian. Now, this was a person who was 40 years old at the time of the interview. But the healthcare provider had just assumed that because they were autistic, they would require a guardian, even though they were an adult. Also, autism could be mistaken for a mental health condition, and care could be denied on that basis. So one person's stimming and communication style was interpreted as mania. So they actually got discharged from the service, and they couldn't be re-referred until they had had 1 year of perfect mental health. But also, healthcare environments were really inaccessible. So accessing healthcare could mean a disruption to people's routine. So, for example, if they had to travel long distances to receive care, that disrupted everyday routines, which caused anxiety. But also, healthcare environments were generally not very sensory friendly. So there was sensory difficulties in terms of colour. So, for example, the lobby had a lot of bright colours, which weren't that fun. It really put me on edge for my first going in because it is a lot to take in sensory-wise. Also, busy environments with lots of people created a lot of sensory overwhelm. So there's always a ton of people. It felt very overwhelming and rushed. Then I think I sometimes miss some of the things I need to say because I'm just like so distracted. And also, healthcare environments were noisy. So one person talked about sitting in the reception and all the phones ringing, and how multiple phones ringing can feel really overwhelming. And also, healthcare environments weren't accessible in terms of communication style. So, for example, many autistic people experience challenges with phone calls, and if that's the only way to get in touch with the clinic, then that can be inaccessible. So, if it's only telephone, there's going to be something that I'm not going to get that I need just because I have a sensory processing delay. Also, accommodations around communication style weren't always offered. So one person said, the nurse mentioned she could see on my notes I was awaiting an autism assessment, but did not ask if there was anything to do to make the phone call easier. And sometimes even when people did request accommodation, those requests were not honoured. So one person reported how they had asked that they be asked close-ended questions, as those were easier to answer than open-ended question, but that didn't happen even after repeated requests. And many people said that having multiple methods of communication, including at least one method in writing, worked better. So incorporating email could be huge because it's faster than a phone call and like way more direct. Also, autism is sometimes used as a reason to deny a person's transgender identity. So there's this misconception that autistic people can't actually know their gender identity. So these are some quotes from 22 autistic gender diverse adults that Strang et al. Interviewed. These people said things like that their gender identity was viewed as an obsession, but they didn't really think it was the same thing. They don't know why there was a perception that it was an obsession. Someone said, I do occasionally worry that thinking I'm trans is going to be judged through the lens of probably some autistic thing. And someone else said, so when I first came out, they said something like, there is a lot of overlap between people who are on the spectrum and people who are transgender. I wondered if they meant, are you sure this isn't just the autism talking? Also, the intersection between autism and gender diversity has been cited as a reason to restrict gender-affirming care in legislation passed in several US states. But this idea that autistic people can't know their gender identity is a misconception. Autistic people can and do know their gender identity. So Kalitsunaki and Williams found that autistic transgender adults reported equivalent levels of childhood gender-typed behaviour and gender dysphoria to non-autistic transgender adults. They also looked at how both autistic and non-autistic transgender adults implicitly experienced their gender, and they found that they identified implicitly with their experienced gender rather than their gender assigned at birth to the same degree. So there was no difference between autistic and non-autistic transgender adults. So this finding is important because this was not testing people's explicit gender identification. It was testing their implicit or subconscious gender identification, and that's still aligned with people's experienced gender for both autistic and non-autistic people. So, what can you do to support autistic LGBTQIA plus people? Well, the first key thing is to presume confidence. A lot of the competence, not confidence. A lot of the barriers that autistic LGBTQIA plus people experience is because there is this stereotype or perception that autistic people are incompetent or that they can't know who they are or what they need. So starting by presuming competence is really important. It's also important to affirm people's identity. Again, believe that people are who they say they are. Ask what name and pronouns they use and use them. That research on how inaccessible healthcare environments were for gender diverse autistic people is actually applicable to all autistic people accessing any type of service. So it's really important to ensure that all environments are accessible from a sensory perspective. So thinking about things like how noisy is it? How bright are the lights? How colourful it is? How many people are there? Is there a quiet space where people can go to chill out if they need it? And also, it's really important to ensure that communication is accessible for everyone. So lots of autistic people find communicating by writing, so over email, for example, easier than talking on the phone or talking in person. Many autistic people find that they process things a bit slower than neurotypical people, and so communicating in writing gives that space to take that time to process what is being said. But as with everything, the most important thing is to ask what someone's communication needs are and then to honour those, because not everyone will have exactly the same communication needs, but you can trust that people know what their communication needs are and provide what they ask for. And finally, for both the autistic and the LGBTQIA plus communities, there's a lot of benefit in being able to connect with other members of the same community. It's always really freeing to find people who are like you. But as we've talked about, autistic people may struggle to connect with either or both of those communities if they do have that intersecting identity. So finding ways to connect them to the community in an accessible way can be really important. So if you're interested in reading any of the references that I've referred to in this presentation, those are there. And I'm going to close with a karakia now. So kia whakairea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, huie tai kie. Thank you.